Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share this project with y'all today. So this, as you just heard, this is coming out of the book I have in progress right now, which finally is in actual manuscript form, thank God. And I'm finishing it up this year. Hopefully it'll come out sometime next year. So the title of my talk today is Putting Real Men on Top, and I'll be talking about the metaphysics of patriarchy, broadly construed. All right, so I want to start off with what might seem to be a couple surprising claims to people, particularly surprising claims for the beginning of a feminist philosophy talk. The first is the claim that no one is oppressed because they are a woman. And the second is the claim that no one is oppressed because they are a man, but many people we take to be men experience gender oppression. Now, importantly, the terms women and men, as I'm using them in these claims, refer to the properties of being a man or being a woman. And what I want to argue today is that both of these claims are true, and that the reason why I think many people have a knee-jerk reaction to them being false is because people have somewhere implicitly absorbed what I call the binary model of patriarchy. And I'll be talking about that at length as well. But just as a kind of intro to the binary model, I want to start off with a quote from the soccer superstar Megan Rapinoe. So this is Megan Rapinoe. She's a midfielder for the US women's national soccer team, has been a huge advocate for women's and LGBT rights in general, but particularly within athletics. And in an interview with the Washington Post, Megan had a really nice quip about the division of power in the world. And she said, quote, "Men have run the world for all these years. Maybe they should just take a few hundred years off, and we women can take it for a few hundred years and we'll see where we are." Now, I really like this quip. I think it's a great quip for an interview, but one thing I want to definitely highlight about it is that it nicely illustrates what I call the binary model of patriarchy. And we can understand the binary model in more formal terms as the idea that patriarchy is a social system of gender oppression in which men are privileged because they are men and women are oppressed because they are women. And what I want to try to convince you of today is that the first piece of this is true and the second piece is false. That is, I do think that patriarchy is a system of gender oppression and that there is a useful concept, importantly, I'll talk about that later, of such a system, but that it's wrong to think of patriarchy as a system that privileges men because they are men and oppresses women because they are women. But of course, if we get rid of this binary model, it leaves a big explanatory gap in our thinking about gender oppression. And particularly, it raises the question, well, if patterns of gender privilege and oppression aren't explained by facts about who are men and who are women, and it certainly is the case, I hope we can all agree that gender oppression and privilege are real, those are real phenomena in the world, then what explains gender privilege and oppression if not facts about who are men and who are women? And what I'm going to argue today is that these patterns are explained not by properties that we have, not by things that we are, like being men or being women, but instead by facts about how we each stand in a particular kind of relation to cultural ideals of manhood and womanhood, where we can understand ideals of manhood and womanhood in a more fleshed out definition as ideals of maleness or the male body and masculinity, and ideals of the female body and of femininity. And so what this is going to suggest in terms of an overall picture of patriarchy is that patriarchy is, yes, a system of gender oppression, but one that works by maintaining and enforcing ideals of manhood and womanhood, and that who benefits most from the maintenance and enforcement of these ideals is not men as an entire group or entire class, but instead a particular group that I'm going to talk about later, which I use the term real men for in a slightly ironic, albeit technical term to refer to. All right, so here's the overview of what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk. So first, I'm going to focus on the negative part of the talk. I'm going to target the binary model and explain why I think it's time to get rid of the binary model. Next, I'll talk about what we should use instead of the binary model, what's going to explain gender oppression, if not facts about who are men and who are women. And then lastly, and then the last fairly quick part of the talk, I will give a more overarching picture of patriarchy as a system that continually continually creates the dominance of real men rather than the dominance of men in general. All right, so now let's go to the first part, against the binary model. All right, so the binary model we've seen is the idea that patriarchy is a social system that advantages men because they're men and disadvantages women because they're women. And this is very much the standard model of patriarchy, both within the history of feminist writing about patriarchy, as well just within popular culture. We saw it, in mass in the 2016 Women's March and the rise, or I should say re-rise of the phrase smash the patriarchy and so on, where you get patriarchy referred to as things like male supremacy, or with some amount of humor, the Planetary Men's Association. So this is very much the kind of go-to definition of patriarchy, is the kind of society in which men are advantaged just because of their being men and women are disadvantaged because they're women. I want to draw out two features of the binary model that I think both individually and collectively result in some serious problems for the binary model. So the first is an ontological feature. The binary model presupposes that the categories of women and men are ontologically prior to gender oppression. And this is because it sees gender oppression as something that acts on the categories of women and men. So whatever women and men are, however we end up defining those categories have to be something that are pre-given prior to patriarchy sorting those categories within a hierarchy. And the second feature, and related to the first feature, is an explanatory feature. The binary model assumes, and in fact, it doesn't assume, it just states that gender privilege and subordination are explained by facts about who are men and who are women. So it's explained by the categories men and women. And of course, these two features are related to each other, right? Because of a kind of general principle within metaphysics that if X metaphysically explains Y, then X is ontologically prior to Y. So we see in the binary model that the categories of women and men are supposed to be doing the explanatory work in telling us what is gender disadvantage and what is gender advantage. And insofar as it relies on these categories to do this explanatory work, it also has to build in that those categories are ontologically prior to gender privilege and gender subordination. All right, so the first problem that arises because of these features is that they suggest that gender oppression just reduces to women's oppression. And in fact, I think we see this on a fairly regular basis. You'll see the terms gender oppression or gender disadvantage, et cetera, any kind of diminutive term like that, used interchangeably with things like women's oppression or women's disadvantage, et cetera. And this is, most explicit, I think, in a lot of radical feminist writing and second wave writing. So Marilyn Frye writes in the 1970s, quote, "If a man has little or no material or political power, or achieves little of what he wants to achieve, his being male is no part of the explanation. Being male is something he has going for him, even if race or class or age or disability is going against him. Women are oppressed as women, but men are not oppressed as men. And isn't it strange that any of us should have been confused and mystified about such a simple thing?" Now, I think that this quote from Frye is really helpful because it makes super explicit what I think is often just kind of assumed in the background, which is that even if a man can be disadvantaged kind of in the overall picture because of things like race or age or disability, that disadvantage has nothing to do with his gender. His being a man is not going to be part of the explanation for why in the overall that person is in a position of disadvantage. And vice versa for women. Even if women can be advantaged by certain things like their race or their class, they're always going to be disadvantaged by virtue of gender. But I think, as many people have pointed out, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too, this picture of reducing gender oppression to a kind of homogenous notion of women's oppression doesn't seem to track how things work in the actual world. So sexuality, race, and class, and so on can't be understood in terms of their effect on people's lives apart from gender, because those things affect how someone's gender is seen and understood, and so how they are treated by other people. So to just use a couple of examples, this binary model, I think, wrongly tells us, at least when understood in the kind of crude sense, it wrongly tells us that why, for example, Black and Latino men are subject to mass incarceration, or why gay men were ignored during the AIDS crisis, has nothing to do with their gender. Their being men has no part of the explanation for those phenomena. And I think that that's just simply wrong. I think it's the case that, from the case of gay men, their sexuality changes how they were seen as men, because expectations and norms of sexuality are part of what it is to be a man. And similarly, in the case of race, being Black changes how you are seen and perceived as a man. In the case of mass incarceration, right, it changes how you are seen in the sense of being seen as a threat or a predator. And we see this pattern all throughout US history. And I think that this points us to an even more fundamental problem with the binary model, and one that can actually explain this reduction of gender oppression to women's oppression and why that goes so wrong, which is the problem of intersectionality. Now, I think intersectionality is best approached with concrete stories. So I'm going to tell quickly 3 stories that nicely illustrate, I think, where the binary model goes awry and not being able to account for these stories. So the first is a classic case talked about at length by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is the case of Emma DeGraff and Reed. So in 1973, General Motors finally started hiring Black women, but in 1974, General Motors fired every Black woman who worked at its assembly plant in St. Louis. And Emma DeGraff and Reed was one of the women who was hired in 1973 and then fired in 1974. And she, along with other Black women who had been fired, sued General Motors under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race and gender. And not long after filing the suit, the case was dismissed. And the judge said that since General Motors had female employees, albeit white ones, and had male employees, albeit Black ones, she did not have a claim to gender or race discrimination. General Motors had female employees and had Black employees. So the judge ruled Emma DeGraff and Reed and the others didn't have a claim to either gender discrimination or race discrimination. And he went on to say, Black women were not a special class under Title VII. They could be protected, he said, as Black or as women, but not as both. We see a similar case arise very recently. So in 2010, Don Zarda was employed as a skydiving instructor in Long Island, New York. And when he disclosed to one of his clients that he was gay, and that client then went and complained to his employer, he was subsequently fired. And he then sued his employer under Title VII as well, claiming that firing him for being gay was an act of gender discrimination under Title VII. And his case then went to the Supreme Court, where it was consolidated with actually 2 other cases, but one of which I'll talk about here, which is the case of Amy Stevens. So in 2013, Amy was employed as at a funeral home in Michigan. And that summer, she decided that she would begin to live and work full-time as a woman. And she wrote her employer a really beautiful letter about this that I highly recommend reading. It's an incredibly moving letter. It's all available in the briefings for the case. And 2 weeks after giving her employer this letter, she was fired. And her employer said that Amy's transition, he said a lot of worse things, which I won't repeat here, but he said, among other things, that Amy's transition made him feel uncomfortable. And she then sued her employer also under Title VII, claiming that firing her for being a transgender woman was a form of gender discrimination. Now, in all 3 cases, despite their vast differences, not only in terms of when they occurred, but also in terms of what was going on in the specifics of the case, you see the same pattern of argument used by the employers to defend themselves against the claim that they had committed an act of gender discrimination. And that argument goes something like this. Premise 1, gender discrimination is treating someone badly simply because they are a man or simply because they are a woman. Premise 2, Emma, Dawn, and Amy were fired for being, respectively, a Black woman, a gay man, and a transgender woman. They were not fired simply for being men or simply for being women. So conclusion, no gender discrimination occurred in any of these cases. Now I want to ask, does the binary model give us any tools for responding to this argument? And I'm just going to take as a datum here, although I'm happy to talk about it more in Q&A, that there's something wrong with the employer's argument, that these cases were, in fact, some form of gender discrimination, and it's on us to explain why that is the case. What I want to argue is that the binary model doesn't provide us with any kind of tools for seeing what is wrong with the employer's arguments. And in fact, it exacerbates the problem because it has an even more reductive understanding of gender discrimination or gender oppression and so on than Title VII, because at least Title VII can account for cases where men are subject to gender discrimination in some form or another, the binary model of patriarchy can't even recognize those cases. It reduces all forms of gender discrimination or disadvantage, see the Fry quote, to women's oppression or women's disadvantage and so on. And I'm not the first to point out this criticism with the binary model, right? So many intersectional theorists, Kimberly Crenshaw, Elizabeth Spellman, Jack Halberstam, and so on, whether they're coming at this from a perspective of Black feminist theory or queer theory or so on, have pointed out that a homogenous notion of women's oppression is going to create huge explanatory problems when you're trying to describe people's experiences and why they have the experiences that they have. But I think that these criticisms that exist already of the binary model fail to go deeply enough. So in some cases, they say that in many cases, they say that we need to see that things like race and sexuality and class impact women's oppression, but they maintain a focus solely on women's oppression as the only manifestation of gender oppression. And of course, that's not going to help people like Don Zarda. That perspective still won't help us see the ways in which men too can be subject to gender disadvantage by virtue of the intersection of things like race and sexuality with being seen as men. But even if they can get away from the notion of women's oppression and just say, look, things like race and sexuality and gender and so on are all working together in any given circumstance to explain how someone is treated, then we come up against another problem, which is that the usefulness of this way of understanding gender oppression is very limited because it can't provide anything like a unified understanding of gender oppression. And that's because it's going to have to explain any given experience of gender disadvantage in terms of a long string of intersecting features. So for any given case, you're going to have to say, well, why did that happen? Oh, it's because that person is a gay, cisgender, white, disabled, poor young man, or a transgender, lesbian, Latina, non-disabled, middle-class woman, etc. And if you want to give anything like an overarching understanding or any kind of unified understanding of gender disadvantage, you'll have to turn to what people have called strategic essentialism, which is, just by description, a approach that sees itself as distorting and in some ways oversimplifying the complexity of the reality in order to achieve certain strategic political ends. And so as a result, I think this approach can give us nothing that's remotely like a unified explanation for gender disadvantage. And that's what the concept of patriarchy was meant to provide in the first place, was a kind of unifying notion of systems of gender disadvantage that could give something in common to people who all experience something that certainly looks like gender disadvantage. And we actually see, this isn't just my opinion, this is something that people who take on this kind of intersection all the way down view say about patriarchy. So in a recent paper by Sally Haslanger, she writes, the move to understand our society as a system that somehow embeds and integrates multiple forms of subordination raises the question whether, and if so how, it is useful to use the term patriarchy for a system of domination, and whether patriarchy is the narrow or proper target of feminist concern. Patriarchy is not the system that oppresses us. Patriarchy is not what we should aim to undermine. If we want a name for the tendency of the social order to target women, we could say we live in a capitalist, white supremacist, nationalist, ableist, ageist, heteronormative, etc., patriarchal order. And so as a result of this way of thinking about the complexity of experiences of gender disadvantage, people like Haslanger, as well as Judith Butler and many others, have said, it's not the project of trying to come up with an understanding of patriarchy that's going to give some sort of unified understanding of gender oppression is just not a project that we should engage in. We should give up on that project altogether. And so maybe they're right, but I'm not ready to throw out the baby with the intersectional bathwater. I think that we can still come up with a useful understanding of patriarchy that both can capture the complexities of the intersectionality of gendered experience while also providing a kind of unified framework for thinking about gender oppression. And that's what I will try to do in this section. All right, so where we've been. If being a man or being a woman doesn't explain why someone experiences gender oppression, or for that matter, gender privilege, then what does? So let's start at the most basic level, right? What is gender oppression? What are we talking about when we talk about gender oppression? It seems to me that a like very simple rubric for understanding the phrase gender oppression is something like oppression that is explained by gender. That what we mean to pick out when we talk about gender oppression as a thing that exists in the world are experiences of oppression or systemic experiences that are oppression, where the explanation for why those experiences occur requires us to appeal to gender. Now, I'm understanding oppression here following Marilyn Frye as a system of forces and barriers that both immobilize and reduce a group or category of people. I'm happy to say more about that in Q&A, as well as its relationship to disadvantage. But for now, I'm going to leave those things kind of fuzzy because it's not my central point here. All right, so with that in mind, the question is, what fits in on the right-hand side? What goes into the gender bubble? And the binary model told us that what goes into the gender bubble was the categories women and men. But we just saw that that isn't going to work. So what are we going to put in instead? And so here are some things that people often use the term gender to mean that we might think can go in on the right-hand side. So sometimes people use the word gender to refer to something like a self-representation of who one is using social and public concepts. Sometimes people use the term gender to refer to people who occupy certain social roles or social positions, and that's kind of the radical feminist move. Or sometimes people use the word gender, and usually the people who use it this way insist that it's the only way that it's used, to refer to biological sex, and in particular, being male or being female. So I myself would want to draw a distinction between biological sex and being male and being female for reasons that will become clear later, but for now, I'll just kind of use them interchangeably. All right, so what I want to argue is that all three of these ways of understanding what might go in on the right-hand side isn't going to work. So first, just regarding the, most quickly for the first two, why the first two aren't going to work for what goes in on the right-hand side, both are self-representations of who we are, as well as the social roles and positions that we fill are themselves shaped by gender oppression and privilege. They are not the things that explain those patterns. And this is something that feminists have been saying for a very long time. So Talia Betcher wrote that a view positing a native gender identity is going to be problematic insofar as it naturalizes sexist cultural phenomenon, right? So the point there is that if we're understanding gender as something like gender identity, that can't be the thing that explains the sexist cultural phenomenon because our self-representations of gender are themselves responsive to a world that's already given with that sexist cultural phenomena, right? And that's not just for trans. I'm using the word gender identity here. Sometimes people hear gender identity and they think trans identity. No, I'm talking about everyone, right? All right, and then secondly, with respect to social positions, Marilyn Frye, I think, very astutely points out that we are all trained to behave differently as men and as women. We mold our bodies and our minds to the shapes of subordination and dominance. So, Frye's point here is that what roles we fill and what positions we occupy is molded to subordination and dominance. It's not the thing that explains the shapes of subordination and dominance. So we need to understand why that molding occurs in the first place. That's the thing we're trying to explain when we're looking for an explanation of what is oppression that is explained by gender. So then you might think, okay, this is where we're going to get down to biology. So maybe what explains gender oppression when we talk what goes in the right-hand side is sex features of the body. But if you want to just talk about sex features of the body alone, so if we go back to this slide, if you just put in on the right-hand side sex features of the body, things like chromosomes and gonads and genitalia, and fill in your favorite sex features here, then you're going to have to be committed to a kind of biological inevitability of patriarchy. If you think there's nothing social that bridges the gap between the body and social hierarchy, you're going to be going along with people like Steven Pinker and so on, who think that men are just by virtue of having testosterone socially dominant and women are biologically destined to be mothers and housekeepers, et cetera, and to not have social and political power. So I hope, again, I'm just going to take as a datum here. I'm not going to argue for this here. Many others have given very compelling reasons, I think, to reject a kind of biological inevitability of patriarchy. But I'm just going to assume here that we all can say that's not the right view. Patriarchy is not a biological inevitability. Okay, so if all three of those things are going to work, then maybe we can go towards what a lot of radical feminists have argued, which is that the thing that goes on the right-hand side is something like the sex features that are defined as maleness and femaleness, as well as the social meanings that are those features are imbued with, the social meanings that those features carry in our world, where that we can, for shorthand, call those things meanings of masculinity and femininity. So, for example, Haslinger in earlier work, I mean, it should be clear from the quote that I just read that this is no longer Haslinger's view, but in a 2000 piece following people like Catherine McKinnon, Haslinger argues that women are disadvantaged due to their perceived reproductive features carrying the social meaning of justified subordination, and similarly argues that men are advantaged due to their perceived reproductive features carrying the social meaning of justified advantage. But I think that this is also not going to work for what goes on the right-hand side. And there's a few reasons for that, but the most important one is that, so let's start off with a few different observations. The first observation is that which features have these meanings? And by that, I mean, which features make a body classified as male or classified as female is not a static thing. It changes across time and it changes across culture, arguably, and I think Sarah Richardson at Harvard has a great piece on this. It also just changes across context, even within a given time and culture. But that doesn't, that's just one observation that doesn't get us where we need to go yet. In addition, we need to see that those sets of features don't actually align with the bodies that people have, right? So actual bodies come in a very wide array of the features that they have. And many of those bodies have features that cluster together in a way that makes them adequately meet the definitions of maleness or femaleness such that they are classified as male or female without any sort of question as to that classification arising. But of course, for some percentage of the population, that's not true, despite the fact that maleness and femaleness are treated as an exhaustive binary for all human bodies. It's not an exhaustive binary, and there are exceptions to these rules. And this is important not because the exceptions disprove the rule, but because the exceptions prove that there was a rule in the first place, right? It shows us that this is not a natural exhaustive binary. There is some sort of rule. But even more importantly, whether our bodies are seen as fating us to be men or women, that is, whether our bodies are classified as male or female, then these exceptions show us that it's not just a matter of the body itself, but it's rather a matter of the body's relation to cultural definitions or ideals about what kind of body is a male body and what kind of body is a female body. So that's the first point, right? That this is not just something about the body itself, but it's about a relation between the body and cultural definitions of what makes someone a man and what makes someone a woman. But in addition to that, that rule, that relation is normative. It's not simply the case that people either are or not male or female. It's the case that in our culture, you must or ought to be male or female. And for those who fail to sufficiently add up or line up with these sets of ideals, and which has historically been and continues to be intersex people, trans people, gay people, indigenous people, people of color, and even hilariously suffragettes in the early 20th century. Those people suffer immensely because they are seen as falling outside of this binary of male or female. And so importantly, we need to account for this gender oppression as well in whatever goes on the right-hand side. We can't simply assume maleness and femaleness as exhaustive in our definition of gender oppression, or we're leaving out an entire realm of phenomena that certainly seems to me to count as gender oppression, which is the way that people are treated because they fail to line up with this you must or ought to be male or female, given cultural definitions of maleness and femaleness. Okay, so that brings us back. That's all just negative. I haven't actually suggested anything positive yet. So we're back to our circles, what goes on the right-hand side. And what I want to suggest here is that instead of understanding what goes on the right-hand side as a property, as something that we are or something that we have, we should understand what goes on the right-hand side as a two-place relation, a relation that holds between individuals on the one hand, in the one place, and between prevailing ideals of maleness and masculinity and prevailing ideals of femaleness and femininity on the right-hand side. And for shorthand, we can consider this a two-place relation that holds between individuals on the one hand and prevailing ideals of manhood and womanhood on the other hand. So now just a little bit about that. All right, so what is this two-place relation? What's some content of this? What kind of relation are we talking about here? I think it is the relation that we can understand as encoding two things. It is the relation of both being bound by those ideals, that is, being evaluated in light of those ideals, and it is the relation of being policed according to those ideals, where you're treated a certain way in light of the evaluation of those ideals. So basically, if you're someone who's bound by the ideals of manhood, you are constantly being evaluated relative to the ideals of maleness and masculinity and being treated a certain way because of how that evaluation turns out. And ditto if you're bound by and policed according to the ideals of womanhood. And this shift helps because when we examine what those ideals are, once we actually go into the history and the anthropology and the sociology and the science studies of what is the cultural ideals of manhood and womanhood, we find that those ideals are by no means politically neutral or non-normative, right? Those ideals themselves have and continue to embed things like racism, nationalism, homophobia, and ableism. And so, what that means for how individuals stand in relation to those ideals is that how an individual stands in relation to things like race and sexuality and nationality and disability is going to affect how they relate to ideals of manhood and womanhood. You know, going back to the case of AIDS, this is very clear, I think, in the case of gay men, right? Where because the ideals of masculinity include the ideal of only wanting to have sex with cisgender men, cisgender women, people who violate that by virtue of their sexuality relate to manhood in a way that makes them evaluated as lesser than and treated badly. To put that very lightly, right? Of course, they can like flesh that out in all of its gory details. And similarly for race, and similarly for disability and class, and so on. And so what we get here is that we can have a unifying notion of what goes in on the right-hand side, but that unifying notion, that two-place relation that holds between individuals and ideals of manhood and womanhood doesn't elide or doesn't oversimplify or distort the intersectional complexity of what that relation looks like for any given person. Because for any given person, what it means to be bound by and policed according to manhood or womanhood is going to look very different depending on what those ideals are in their time and place, and also how they relate to things like race and nationality and class and so on that are also embedded in those ideals. Okay, so now with that in our back pocket, I want to now offer the positive view of patriarchy, which is, as a slogan, patriarchy is a dynamic system of real men's dominance. So shifting from the notion of men's dominance to real men's dominance. So the contrast here, the foil where we started off, was the binary model. So the binary model, again, just to reiterate, says that patriarchy is a system of gender oppression. Men are privileged because they are men, and women are oppressed because they are women. And what I'm suggesting we replace that with is the idea that patriarchy is a system of gender oppression in which people are privileged or oppressed in various ways and to various degrees because of how they relate to ideals of manhood and womanhood. And in particular, patriarchy is a system that maintains those ideals and that enforces those ideals against individuals. All right, so but that raises the question, since the ideals of manhood and womanhood, as you know, I'm sure we all know, those change over time and those change over culture, right? So we want to talk about the ideals of manhood and womanhood. That would be, you know, you shouldn't use the definitive article "the" to describe those ideals if you're talking in a kind of universal way or even a transcultural way or a transhistorical way, because as I said before, even ideas about what bodies count as male or female change over time and culture, much less ideas of what masculinity and femininity are, right? These things are like very much squishy and moving all over the place. So if that's true, what's common to various patriarchal societies, such that we can give anything that looks like a unified model of those societies? And what I want to argue is that patriarchy is a system in particular that maintains the dominance of real men. And in fact, not only is this despite the fact that patriarchy changes over time, but it's because patriarchy changes over time. So I want to think of patriarchy as a dynamic system, one that adapts to challenges and disruptions in order to maintain what we can think of as kind of like its equilibrium or its status quo of keeping a particular group of people in power. And that group of people, I want to use the term real men for. Like I said earlier, I'm using this with a big dollop of irony. I don't think that there's any such thing as real men. In fact, it should be clear, I don't really think that there's such a thing as men. I think there are people who are bound and policed by ideals of manhood. So insofar as I'm using the term men, that's what I'm defining. That's when I say men, I mean people bound and policed by ideals of manhood. And when I say women, I mean people bound and policed by ideals of womanhood. And so what I mean by real men, when I use that phrase, is the group that is most benefited by the content of the ideals of manhood and the enforcement of the ideals of manhood. And importantly, that benefit isn't just direct to them, it's also through the mechanism of disadvantaging other people. So disadvantaging people who are seen as disvalued in some sort of way because of how they relate to the ideals of manhood or because of how they relate to the ideals of womanhood. And in fact, I think as Kate Mann nicely points out, as many others, just being bound and policed by the ideals of womanhood, even if you do a great job because of your race and class and disability and sexuality and so on of matching up to those ideals, even if you're the closest thing you can get to being a so-called real woman, you're still going to be disvalued in a society that values manhood over womanhood. So real men we can think of as the group that is benefited not only directly because of how they relate to the ideals of manhood, but they also are advantaged because of disadvantage that is accrued by those who are bound by the ideals of womanhood, as well as those who are bound by the ideals of manhood, who are seen as falling short in some sort of way of those ideals. Okay, so just a little bit on what I mean when I talk about being benefited by the content and enforcement of these ideals. So as I mentioned before, both of these things are, both the content and the enforcement are dynamic. I'm not going to focus on that here. I'm going to focus more on the intersectional point because I think the argumentative pressure is on showing that a subset of the people bound by manhood, that is real men, are the main beneficiaries of patriarchy. So let's unpack a little bit the ideals of manhood. So I want to separate these again into these two sets of ideals. The ideals of maleness on the one hand, and the ideals of masculinity on the other hand. So the ideals of maleness, I think we can understand as basically what is considered to be, within the prevailing ideology, the essence of manhood. That is the features that metaphysically explain why someone is a man. So if, within the kind of dominant imaginary, if asked like what makes someone a man, people appeal to maleness, or they appeal to like these, or I guess it's not even maleness, it's these ideals of maleness, as if someone adequately matches up to those ideals, that's enough to make them a man. And the ideals of masculinity, I think, have to be understood relative to maleness, because I think masculinity is the features that are believed to be teleologically inevitable or good or appropriate for the people who meet the essential ideals of manhood. So here I think we see some kind of like folk teleology, some kind of like folk Aristotelianism, where you have the essence of a thing on the one hand, and then the teleology that is determined by that essence on the other. So maleness is the essence of manhood, and by virtue of having that essence, you have a given design or purpose, which is masculinity. And so you ought, it is virtuous, it is good, it is appropriate to fulfill masculinity, because that is the telos of manhood. All right, but now when we dig into the content of maleness and masculinity, we find that these ideals are thoroughly intersectional. So historically, among others, Black and gay persons have been excluded from unambiguous classification as male. So Tommy Curry has really great work on the 19th century classification of Blackness as a Black, like thinking of Indigenous people, and particularly Black Indigenous people, as a different species than white people. And because of that was being filtered through an evolutionary lens, right, where being male in the sense of being someone who is a man is species specific. You have to be a human male to be a man. And because Blackness was seen as a different species than whiteness, it made the idea that Black men, or Black, what we would today recognize as Black men, in the 19th century suspect, right? It was like outside of the realm of the human male because not human. And similarly, there's really good work on the history. I particularly recommend a new anthology that's edited by David Hurt called Third Gender, Third Sex, on the historical classifications of gay people in the West as gender inverts or hermaphrodites, where sexuality was itself seen as part of the definition of maleness. So if someone, doesn't matter if you have unambiguous so-called genitalia and so on, if you have penis but are attracted to other people with penises, that makes your classification as as male itself thrown into suspicion. And similarly, even today we see an exclusion from unambiguous classification as male for trans men, regardless, even if you just want to talk about biology, it doesn't matter what kinds of medical or surgical interventions a trans man has had, he's still going to be excluded from classification as male. So what we see here is that with respect to the ideals of maleness, there's a consistent pattern over time of excluding particular groups, particularly already marginalized groups, from unambiguous classification as male. And there's many other examples. I'm happy to talk about them more in Q&A. And something similar, I think in a more obvious way exists with respect to the ideals of masculinity. So being disabled, being gay, being homeless, being Black, these also historically have and continue to be a basis for evaluation as insufficiently masculine. And what I mean when I say insufficiently masculine, I want to make a quick note about that. Insufficiently masculine does not simply mean emasculated. Because what we see for each of these groups, for any group that is systematically excluded or marginalized within manhood, is that that group is simultaneously emasculated and hypermasculinized, right? So gay men on the one hand are treated as effeminate, but also have been treated as sexual predators. Similarly, Black men historically have been treated as like childlike, but also treated as predators and brutes, etc. Similarly for disabled people, similarly for working class men, etc. So there's a constant pattern of both treating these marginalized men as too close to womanhood to be real men, and also too far outside humanhood to count as real men. And both those things happen at the same time. And we see a similar intersectionality when we turn to the enforcement of the ideals of manhood. And I think this intersectionality is allowed in some ways, or it's made particularly possible by the fact that the ideals of manhood, particularly the ideals of masculinity, contain internal tensions. So there's both a kind of ideal of aggressiveness and physicality, and there's also an ideal of kind of self-control and civility. And this sort of internal tension that exists within manhood means that those ideals are very easily inconsistently enforced against different groups of men. And I think we see this really obviously with respect to a kind of tension that exists between something like chivalry on the one hand and aggression on the other, where if a white man is aggressive, we often see this behavior excused as something like boys will be boys. It's sort of the biological inevitability of his manhood that he's aggressive. But if a Black man commits the same act of aggression or is accused of the same act of aggression, instead of getting it excused as boys will be boys, we see a language of that's like unmanly, or it's bestial, or it's condemned in very clear terms. So I think that's kind of a clear case. And I really recommend the work of Gail Baderman on this, particularly with respect to race, but you have this kind of inconsistent application of the ideals of manhood against different groups of men as well. All right, so what's the takeaway here? There's two, a negative takeaway and a positive takeaway. So the negative takeaway is simply this: patriarchy is not a system of male dominance and female subordination, and the categories of women and men don't explain patterns of gender oppression and privilege. The binary model doesn't work. And the positive takeaway is that we don't have to give up, therefore, on the notion of patriarchy. We can have a useful notion of patriarchy as a system of gender oppression. And it's one that generates patterns of gender oppression and privilege on the basis of how people stand in a two-place relation of being bound by and policed according to prevailing ideals of manhood and womanhood. And that these ideals and their enforcement have a consistent pattern across their dynamic manifestations and intersectional manifestations, which is that whoever the real men are in a given instance of patriarchy, you'll find the real men on top. Thanks.